Can you imagine a lawyer, a woman, challenging the courts in colonial America almost 300 years before women in the U.S. could even vote? Well, today, that's whose incredible story we're diving into, Margaret Brent.
But here's the thing, before we jump back to the 1600s, let's talk about why she's so important right now. Her story isn't just some dusty old footnote in a history book. Her legacy is actually shaping the modern legal world as we speak.
So let me ask you, when you think about America's great legal pioneers, who comes to mind? Maybe Thurgood Marshall, Sandra Day O'Connor. Well, what if I told you that the story really kicks off with a woman way back in the 17th century?
Her name was Margaret Brent, and just to put that in perspective, she was born around the same time Shakespeare was writing his final plays. It's wild to think that she would go on to become one of the most powerful legal and political figures in the American colonies.
And listen, this isn't just some historian's opinion. This is a quote from the American Bar Association, the ABA. They call her a master negotiator and an accomplished litigator. I mean, those are incredibly powerful words for any lawyer, let alone a woman living in the 1600s.
Her impact is so profound, so lasting, that today the ABA's highest honor for women lawyers is literally named after her, the Margaret Brent Women Lawyers of Achievement Award. Her name is now a modern symbol for breaking barriers in the legal world. So, how on earth did she do it?
Well, to really get her story, you got to picture the world she was walking into. A world that was absolutely not designed for a woman like Margaret Brent.
Okay, so the year is 1638. Margaret Brent shows up in the Maryland colony. Now, just being a Catholic in an English colony was already a pretty big deal. But being an unmarried woman, a spinster they called it, who was choosing to stay single in this brand new world, that was practically unheard of.
And get this, the gender ratio was completely skewed. For every one woman in Maryland, there were 6 men. You can just imagine the immense social pressure to get married and run a household. But yeah, Margaret had very different plans.
She didn't just push back against expectations, she completely shattered them. She started her own estate with her sister, calling it Sister's Freehold. She was a seriously sharp businesswoman, growing tobacco, running a successful mill, and then, most importantly, she started representing people in court. She acted as an attorney for herself, for her family, and for other colonists.
And her track record in court was frankly unbelievable. Over just 8 years, she was involved in 124 court cases. Her success rate? 100%. You heard that right. She won every single case. This was not a hobby. This was a woman who had mastered the law.
And it's a good thing she was so skilled, because her legal talents were about to be put to the ultimate test. This time, it wasn't just a client's farm on the line. It was the survival of the entire Maryland colony.
So by the mid-1640s, Maryland was an absolute mess. A violent conflict called Ingles Rebellion had ripped the colony apart. The governor, Leonard Calvert, managed to get back in control, but he had to hire a bunch of mercenary soldiers to do it, and he promised to pay them. And then he just suddenly dies, leaving behind a colony in chaos and a bunch of armed, angry, and unpaid soldiers.
On his deathbed, Governor Calvert knew there was only one person he could trust to handle this mess. He named Margaret Brent his executrix, the person in charge of his entire estate, and gave her one simple, desperate command: take all and pay all.
So what does she do? She finds out the governor's personal money isn't nearly enough to pay the soldiers. A mutiny is brewing, which would have totally destroyed the colony. So Margaret makes a bold executive decision. She starts selling off cattle that belonged to the colony's owner, Lord Baltimore, to pay the soldiers' wages, and she imports corn to feed everybody. She, by herself, stopped a total collapse. She literally saved Maryland.
Okay, so having just saved the entire colony, you'd think they'd give her a medal, right? Well, Margaret Brent was about to demand something that would echo for centuries, something much more powerful than a medal.
On January 21st, 1648, she walks into the all-male Maryland Assembly, and she's not there to ask for a favor, she's there to claim what she believes are her rights. And this is where you really see her legal brilliance shine. She makes 2 separate, very clever demands. First, she argues that as an independent landowner, a freeholder, she's entitled to a vote, just like any man who owned land. And second, as the legal attorney for the colony's proprietor, Lord Baltimore, she demands a voice, another vote, to represent his interests.
And the Assembly's response? It was immediate, and it was final. They denied her request. Even after she had literally saved them all,
The idea of a woman having a formal vote and voice, it was just a step too far for them.
But here's the thing. Even though they said no, that moment in the Maryland Assembly, that is what cemented her legacy. It wasn't just a request for herself. It was a foundational moment in the long, long fight for women's rights.
Now, Lord Baltimore, who was safe and sound back in England, was furious that she sold his cattle, so she decides to move to Virginia. But this was no defeat. She established a whole new plantation and she perfectly named it Peace. She continued to thrive, and by the time she died, she owned almost 10,000 acres of land.
It actually took over 250 years for people to look back and grasp just how significant that day in 1648 was. Harper's Magazine wrote that her demand wasn't just about property or power. It was the very first time a woman in America made such a clear, public stand for her political rights.
And if you want to understand just how radical she was, you have to look at this number. In her time, something like 85% of the entire population, that includes all women, all children, servants, slaves, they were all legally considered unfree. They had no basic rights. So her demand wasn't just unusual, it challenged the entire structure of their society.
You know, more than a century after this, Abigail Adams would write that famous letter to her husband John, telling him to remember the ladies when he was building a new nation. But let's be clear, Margaret Brent wasn't just asking to be remembered. She was demanding to be heard, to be counted, and to vote, 128 years before the Declaration of Independence was even written.
So think about that. She made her stand in 1648. The 19th Amendment, which finally gave women the right to vote, wasn't passed until 1920. That is a 272-year gap. It really makes you wonder, how many other pioneers like her are out there in history whose demands just took centuries to finally be answered?